on my attention. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Kia ora, ni hao, another episode of 1 of 200. This is an interview, a special episode of 1 of 200, in which we interview one of our favorite longtime correspondents with whom we have not corresponded as much as maybe we might like for a long time. We have me, Philip. I'm one of your co-hosts. We also have Kyle. How are you doing, Kyle?
Good, I'm doing good. Nice sunny day. Nice cool evening as well. Not too hot. Very excited to talk about this topic.
It is exciting. We're talking Te Pāti Māori with one of our best friends, Jack McDonald. How are you doing, mate? Long time no see.
Kia ora, Philip. Kia ora, Kyle. I'm good. I'm well. It has been a long time. Good to be back with you all. And yeah, hopefully we can get into Te Pāti Māori and why it's such a mess right now.
I love that.
Strong opening.
Yeah, strong opening. Strong and also correct opening. Love that. Love that for all of us. Okay, so look, Jack, we've had you on the podcast, I don't know, mate, maybe 2 to 5 times, who remembers? But one thing that I always love about your contributions is that you're pretty brutally honest, even about teams that on paper you are on. Like in the same way as we are, I think. I think 1 of 200 in general is pretty honestly kind of papered down as on the left of center. No one's going to doubt that, but also we spend more time criticizing people on the left because we want to make them sort the shit out, right? Like that's you want your team to be the one that's right. So look, based on that, I thought a good place to start would be, can you give us, just to start with, a quick history of where you kind of come from? It's been a few years since you've been on the pod. Who are you? What's your kind of background, man?
Big question. So I grew up here in Paikakiriki on the Kapiti coast where I still live. I come from Taranaki in terms of my whakapapa, and also actually from Te Whakatō here in the Bay of Plenty as well. And come from a family of writers and artists and librarians, and grew up in a very artistic but also left and socially and environmentally conscious community here in Paikakiriki. And so I guess that really informed my politics and who I am as a person. And I was one of those nerdy kids who always wanted to be a politician, and always wanted to be in politics, which was not a result of my upbringing in the sense of my family weren't overly political, really. Like we weren't the kind of family that goes on protests all the time, which is, my 2-year-old daughter has already been on more protests than I did before I was, 15, probably. So it was kind of that drive to be involved in how the country's decisions are made that I had kind of as a personal drive. But yeah, so the first protest we did go on, and probably the only one I did with my family, was in 2004, which is really useful in terms of this conversation because that was the foreshore and seabed hikoi, and that was what gave birth to the Māori Party. And, so I think it's, something that I've always been conscious of is that my politics were born, in essence, in opposition to the Labour Party. I was always very left-minded, but, because of that kind of historic betrayal that Helen Clark oversaw in 2004 of the largest confiscation in the history, largest single confiscation in the history of the country, Labour Party politics was never going to be something that I was involved in. And so, in that sense, it was very natural that I ended up in the Green Party, which is kind of, where I met you guys and where I kind of spent most of my political life. And I think the Māori Party might have also been an option, but was working with National, and that was just kind of not a goer for me. Who wants to support a party that's in coalition with John Key? Not me, anyway. So that was kind of why I ended up in the Greens, and I stood in free elections, and I held a huge amount of different party roles, and I worked for the party, for Materia and Marama, and it was basically defined my youth was my involvement in the Green Party. And yeah, that kind of I kind of came to a very frustrating end in the James Shaw era, and left because of James Shaw's leadership. And yeah, and then I was kind of out of politics for a while, but somehow ended up back in politics, mostly by accident, because I was working for my iwi for Ngāti Rauanui and supporting Debbie Ngāti Wapeka, who was the CEO, and then she stood for Parliament for the Māori Party, and I ended up back at Parliament working for her. But yeah, that's potentially but yeah, that's a quick rundown anyway.
No, look, man, that's really useful just because probably I want to say the vast majority of people listening to this don't know who you are.
Yeah.
We've had you on, but that was many years ago. That's good to know that that's kind of your, I guess, political and ideological background to the up until this point, right?
Mm.
Okay, so safe to say you've paid a pretty close to the point of maybe debilitating attention to political ideology.
Absolutely.
Okay. So look, let's talk about political generations, right? In terms of Te Pāti Māori, like you've already said that a formative like moment for you was the hikoi, the Foreshore and Seabed hikoi,
Mm.
which was Tariana and then, Peter Sharples in a different kind of configuration. Can we talk kind of first generation like Māori Party and like what that was?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Like I mean, I was obviously not involved with the party at that time, but I think from an outsider's perspective, the Māori Party was a very natural formation in the sense that pan Māori parties have always been, if not a feature of New Zealand politics, a prospect. And they've been tried before. There was a kind of early effort to try and operate along those lines in the early 1900s or mid 1900s with Siapidana Ngata and James Carroll and those Māori politicians of the day who had a kind of grouping called the Young Māori Party. It wasn't actually a party; they were still members of mainstream parties, but they were kind of operating outside of traditional Pākehā mainstream politics to try and pursue collective Māori interests. And then there have been other attempts as well. There was the Mana Motuhake Party, which was set up by Matsurata when he left the Labour Party, and that was part of the alliance for quite a while. Sandra Lee was involved, Willie Jackson, and others. And so it was a natural, yeah, it was a natural thing that when Tariana left the Labour Party, that was an opportunity, such a historic betrayal of Māori, given Labour was, the traditional party of Māori voters. And so, but I think one of the things that's interesting to look back on now is that the Māori Party never really had a kind of coherent ideological base. And it was interesting because when I ended up working for the Māori Party in, 2020, 2021, I went and looked back at some of their old policies, and the founding president of the Māori Party, Whatarangi Winiata, who's a very esteemed Māori academic and is behind the establishment of Te Wānanga Raukawa and all of the like kind of cultural revitalization stuff that happens in Otaki, which is close to where I live. But anyway, he had put out this tax policy that was essentially a flat tax policy, and was arguably to the right of the ACT Party. And I was like, it was so funny because I was looking back at policies, being like, oh, I wonder if there's some good stuff here to kind of, draw back on, and certainly not in the economic and tax space, that's for sure. So, but at the same time, they're also pursuing what would be on the face of it very left-wing policy. And so there was always that kind of tension and kind of incoherence. And that's why you could see them end up working with a national party government. And, at the time, I didn't have much good to say about them, but looking back on it, they did achieve some really significant things. Like the establishment of whānau ora was a really significant thing, and although the National Party supported it for their own reasons, it kind of fitted in with Bill English's social investment approach, which is deeply flawed and really problematic. But whānau ora itself isn't inherently, flawed, and it has actually led to incredibly good outcomes and has kind of one of the highest performing social service delivery mechanisms in the country and is able to reach into a lot of hard to reach communities, as they're called, that the state can't. And you really saw that in COVID, because it was like whānau ora, they were able to vaccinate large Māori and Pacifica communities that the state was just not have a hope of doing. So yeah, I mean, those are kind of my kind of high level reflections on the original Māori Party. Like, I think that they did a lot of good in their own way, but there was always that tension, and of course that tension blew up when Hone Harawira basically decided he could no longer stomach the compromises that they were making. The essential, like, that they supported they repealed the the Foreshore and Seabed Act. They brought in the Marine and Coastal Area Act, and that was nowhere near good enough in terms of what their voters were really wanting. It was still basically confiscating Māori land, and there are a number of other things as well, which I can't remember all of them, but I think like he opposed, like, I think their support of the ETS at the time, and I think sell off of state housing, and there are a number of different things that made him leave. And he formed the Mana Party, for those who might not remember, with Sue Bradford and a lot of like John Minto and a lot of Pākehā leftists joining with Tino Rangatira movement, which for many people was a really hopeful and inspiring time, and somehow ended up with them doing a deal with Kim.com and Laila Hare coming on as leader, wearing like some kind of like Star Trek outfit, and
Just
the internet party, right?
the internet party. Yeah.
quick, no shame to people who happen to enjoy Star Trek. It's fine to enjoy Star Trek.
Yeah.
Don't feel bad about that.
No, I mean, I'm not a Star Trek fan personally. I love Star Wars. I love science fiction, but it was just very odd to see Laila Hare. Yeah. Anyway,
It was weird. It was a weird time. I think
Yeah.
for all of us, it was a weird time, Jack.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like I think it's really interesting in terms of the current conflict, which we'll get into more, I'm sure. But what's very different about that compared to when Hone left the Māori Party and formed Mana is that there was a very ideological reason behind what he was doing, and a strategic reason as well, and that doesn't really exist this time.
I was going to ask, in terms of the initial formation of the Māori Party and the way it was, you mentioned this huge conflict between Labour and Māori, a crisis essentially that meant the Māori Party was a single issue party in a lot of respects. In terms of the way that it created the structures of the organization, that then led on to those ideological cleavages among different ideological bents. How important or how much of an impact did that have?
It's a really good question, and I think I've been reflecting on that a bit recently, because basically my view is that the current issues all stem from a lack of process, poorly drafted constitutional rules, and essentially a lack of party infrastructure. And I think that all stretches back to the formation of the Māori Party, because most of the people who are involved in the formation of that party didn't have much experience in party politics. Most of them were very experienced Māori leaders and remarkable in many ways, and yeah, like extraordinary individuals, but at the same time they weren't party political apparatchiks, and so they didn't necessarily have the experience and insight to think of all of the different structures and processes that they needed. I think Tariana Turia was really the only one involved who was, and there might have been a few others behind the scenes, but for the most part was the primary person involved who actually had a lot of party political experience. So I think the party was set up in a rather rudimentary way, and they basically use an electric based system, but there is a lot of centralization in terms of the key national decisions being made by a national council body that isn't necessarily representative of all of the party members, let alone Te Māori as a whole. And if you're doing it if you're doing it right, which I think they were at that time, in terms of basically like participatory democracy, like they were going out to the regions constantly and having these hui to decide what to do, I think it could work well, but the infrastructure didn't require that. I think that was more of a cultural thing at the time. And so if you let that culture slip, and don't keep that kind of disciplined approach, then I think you start to see problems which have eventuated today.
The other question in that same space I was interested in asking, you mentioned that there's always been this opportunity for a pan-Maori movement. One of the arguments, I guess, I see being made both from Labour and National at the moment, and you see it across social media quite a bit, whether it's real engagement or not, is, and you've seen it in the media just really recently as well, is that Te Pāti Māori doesn't speak for all Māori. How do those two realities interact with this, this huge outpouring of political will behind the original hikoi that the Maori Party got formed around, and then that slippage as the cultural shift that you described, like was happening, maybe not talking with membership or talking with the iwi Māori as much as they needed to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that the Maori Party doesn't speak for all Maori. I mean, that's just a reality. Like the Maori are represented in the supporters and voters of all parties. Certainly, a lot fewer on the right. The majority of Maori by far vote for left-wing parties, but you're never ever going to achieve a one party that can speak for all Maori. But I think and then Maori Party has always kind of the base of its support have always been kind of predominantly made up of Maori communities who are particularly strong in terms of their cultural revitalization, and that cuts across class lines. And it's not you can't say that it's particularly like a middle class party or the converse. Some criticisms are that the Maori Party is inherently like a middle class party, but I don't think that's true. It's rural and urban. It cross class boundaries, but it is generally people who are more connected to their culture and to their whānau hapu and iwi structures. And yeah, so I think that and the Māori Party is, before the recent dramas, was at its most popular, I think in part because of the cultural revitalization that has been happening at pace in Māori communities. And that has kind of been symbiotic in the last few years, is that the Māori Party and this kind of cultural renaissance have been feeding off each other. And so in that sense, that's where they get their mandate. And I think that one of the most disappointing things with the current dramas is that so many Māori have put their hopes and dreams into the Māori Party as a political vehicle. And I think thousands of young people in particular have actually seen themselves represented in the halls of power for the first time. And the original Māori Party started that, but they took quite a different approach. They were much more trying to work within the system. They were trying to use the levers of power to achieve policy outcomes. The current Māori Party are much more oppositional to the Westminster system and using it as a platform to push cultural revitalization and to basically send a message to the Māori people that they have the right, but also the ability to be Māori, whatever that looks like, in Pākehā spaces, and to actually be unapologetic about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's been the watchword basically for the last term, right? Of
Yeah.
Te Pāti Māori has been unapologetically Māori, is what every MP and operator has been saying at every opportunity, right? And I don't mean that in like a good or bad way. It's
Yeah.
just that that's been what they've used to like create that space. Can you very quickly move us through the space of time between that first, second generation of the Maori Party and what we have now? What happened between Tariana and Peter Sharples and what we have in the Debbie Rauri space? Like, what was that transition like for
Yeah.
you as far as you knew?
Yeah, sure. So obviously the original Māori Party started to become quite unpopular because of their relationship with the National Party. And then in the end, they ended up basically with a rump of only one electorate seat, Waiariki, Tudoro Flavel holding that seat, and then having one list MP, which was Marama Fox. So they were the co-leaders before Debbie Rauri took over. When Tudoro lost in Waiariki in 2017 to Tamati Coffey, the Māori Party were basically pushed out into the wilderness. and they basically were then in a kind of rebuild phase. The Shea Wilson took over as the party president from Tuku Morgan, and Kapua Smith was the vice president, and they basically laid the groundwork for the revival of the party, and did some really good work along those lines, and kind of sent a message that they had learnt lessons in terms of not listening to their people and staying with National for too long and those kinds of things. And then basically they begun the process of candidate selection, and basically a transition to the new leadership. And so Rauri Waititi was selected in Waiariki, Debinare Wapeka in Te Tai Hauauru, and then crucially John Tamihere and Tamaki Makaurau. And the decision was made that Debbie and John would be the new co-leaders. The result of that election was that, so that's how I kind of came into the picture, because I was working for Debbie and helping with her campaign. As part of that, we helped write some of the new policies for the 2020 election, some of the environmental and social policies, and so Rauri, his win in Waiariki is what got the party back into parliament, and he's got an undeniable political magnetism, especially at that time, and so a mixture of his kind of charisma and their grassroots campaigning in Waiariki is what won the day. But I think also what helped was that we were starting to release decidedly left-wing policies, and that really signaled that there had been a clean break with the previous iteration of the party. And I mean, John Tamihere too, for all his faults, I think recognised early on that needed to happen, that from a strategic point of view, the party had to take a kind of radically left posture in terms of social, economic and environmental policy if it was going to win back the trust of Māori voters.
Yeah, I mean that, like, just strategically, right? Like, we're not even talking at a moral or ethical kind of point right now, but that at the time, that is what was missing, right? There was, and I would say still is, a pretty wide swath of like Māori Party sympathetic voters who don't have anyone to vote for if you want something that's like, you want a state that protects you, and you're talking about Papatūānuku, that, there's a real kind of, there's a gap there, right? And in terms of like generation one of the Māori Party, maybe it wasn't hitting the mark, right? Especially if you're talking about younger generations of people who, the Kura kind of generation, right? Like people make a lot of that, and I don't know, I'm honestly not convinced whether that is a big deal or not. What do you think, Jack? Do you think that's a genuine, like, game changing? I'm just never convinced of like generational arguments like that. But a lot of people talk about, like, there have been a lot of kids who've grown up through like the Kura kaupapa, like, generation, whatever. Do you think that's actually going to make a difference politically in terms of
There
thought?
is definitely some salience to that argument. It doesn't mean that generation is inherently supportive of the Māori Party, but what it does indicate is that there is, and I kind of was referring to this a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
There is a cohort of younger Māori who are much more culturally empowered and connected, and therefore, have the bandwidth to support this kind of project. And like, so for example, like if you go to a kapahaka festival, or I was asked to judge a regional Ngā Manu Kōrero speech competition recently here in Kapiti, which I used to do when I was at school. And these teenagers are all giving speeches about Hana Rāwhiti, or about Rawiri and about Debbie, and how much they inspire them. And so that is a very real thing. And that, of course, then they're also talking to their whānau. It has an impact on the whole community. And you saw that in the most recent hikoi last year as well, is that Māori organising is very different to Pākehā organising. And I've been reflecting on this a lot because I'm working in the union movement. And Māori are able to mobilise en masse in a way that the union movement used to be able to, like in the early 1900s, in the sense that it's community organising in a very profound and grassroots way. It's like these days unions can mobilize those who are union members if they use things like stop work meetings to actually enable them to get off the job. But Maori will bring their whole whānau, they'll bring their whole school, they'll bring their whole workplace,
Yes.
and so
Yep.
it's very different. And I think that Māori Party have been able to tap into that in a really significant way. But that's not to say that other parties or movements won't be able to. It's just that Māori Party are kind of capturing the zeitgeist of that at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, you are absolutely speaking our language, Jack. I feel like you've said exactly the kind of shit that we've been talking about for the last however long it's been since the last Hikoi. No, 100%, right? Like the organizational strategy is a real thing, and it just hasn't. I feel like it hasn't been paid attention to enough by the left in a non-Te Māori space. It's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look. We're already coming up to what we need to be talking about, which is why everyone signed up to this podcast. What the fuck is going on, Jack, with Te Pāti Māori in the last few months? Did you see Hannah's thing today?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, I thought, like, way to be the only mature one in the room, right? Like, that was
Absolutely.
my first response.
Yeah.
But look, what's your response? Like, you're the one who knows all these people. What's your kind of your gut response? And then can we go from there?
I mean, in terms of what Hannah was saying, you're absolutely right. That is the response. And you know, I think that, well, to take a step back. So I worked for the party as a policy director from 2020 through to kind of early 2023, and I left because I had a baby, or my partner had a baby, and I really wanted to get out of politics. But I think, one of the things that's important to kind of reflect on in terms of why this has come as such a shock, I think, to so many people, is that in the last term, there was an incredible discipline actually, and that was partly it was easy to achieve because it was Rowley and Debbie were the only MPs, so they just had to not fall out with each other basically. But the party really didn't engage in Parliament in the way that traditional parties do. There was none of the engagement in Beltway gossip. There wasn't leaking from media. In fact, it was hard for journalists to get interviews with the Maori Party at all, which infuriated them. But it was very clear and intentional strategy on behalf of the party to not get caught up in the traditional way of doing politics, but rather to use Parliament as a platform and to basically be a bit distant and a bit mysterious in the sense of not because people can start to pick you apart when they know the internal dynamics and the internal tensions. So anyway, that's just a small footnote, but I think as someone who was involved at the time, it was clear that there were tensions and that things were going to bubble up and essentially burst over. But that's not so much because of personalities. It's more, although it's part of it, and there is issues in terms of leadership. But more than anything, it's actually because of what I was talking about earlier in terms of the lack of process and the lack of structure. As someone who came from the Green Party, who you could say has too much process sometimes, I was very conscious of that because the Māori Party was the complete opposite. And if you look at the successes of a party like the Greens, they're a minor party that has stayed incredibly resilient and successful electorally because they have the infrastructure, the processes and rules, and the culture to support that, so that basically issues can be dealt with, and personalities don't overpower the kaupapa. And so I think that basically the current crisis in the Māori Party comes from a lack of process and structure. And it sounds boring, but it's just true. I think so basically what precipitated the crisis that we see right now is that both Maria Mino and Takutu, the two MPs who have now been expelled, had made some fuck ups essentially. Maria Mino's were more kind of behind the scenes and more procedural, and I won't go into them too much because they're not actually really that important. And then Takutu's were more public. Obviously, his comments around Penny Hinea's campaign team, which were frankly racist. And so the co-leaders tried to pull those MPs into line, but those MPs basically refused to accept the authority of the co-leaders because of these ongoing issues around a concentration of power and a lack of process. So there is a very kind of concentrated small group at the top of the party that make all the decisions. And it's the co-leaders, it's John Tomihere as the president, and it's the general manager who's John's daughter, Kiri Tomihere Waititi, and all of them are forces of nature. Like they all play a huge role in bringing the party back into parliament and to be in the position of success that they were in before this crisis. Like the Māori Party was the most popular it had ever been. It had the most seats that it ever had. It was polling far higher than it ever did under the previous iterations of leadership, and it had just won a huge mandate in Tamaki Makaurau against an experienced MP in Penny Henare. So it's amazing in that, like, almost now 3 months since then, it's all fallen apart. But so basically, that small group of people hadn't basically put in place the structures and processes to ensure that it could be an enduring movement and that it wasn't reliant on those big personalities at the center. And so that kind of basically all blew up in the sense of there not being these processes and consensus-based leadership, which are kind of Hannah was kind of referring to a little bit today in terms of how these internal caucus dynamics could be dealt with. So yeah, there's a lot behind it, but basically there aren't really any clear ideological or strategic dividing lines in terms of this conflict. It's more issues of leadership and basically competing egos and there not being proper, transparent, agreed upon processes to deal with those conflicts.
I mean, doesn't that make it a personality thing, Jack? Like, what's the alternative? Like, if it's not ideology and it's not, deep-seated disagreements about what we're all working towards, is that not a personality issue? I totally hear what you're saying about like it is processes because these things could be resolved if you'd already had processes that would have, preempted an issue like this. But if you hadn't had the personalities that
Yeah.
happen to be, rubbing up against each other in such a frictionful way, doesn't it like isn't that a personality issue? It does seem
Yeah,
like
no, totally is. It's a personality issue on both sides of that divide.
okay.
Hannah saying that they're all wrong is true. They've all played a part in what has eventuated. I think where ideology perhaps does come into it is that lack of ideological coherence that we talked about in relation to the original Māori Party. That
Yeah.
plays a role here too, in that, like, if there was a clear sense of ideological coherence, then I think it would be harder for such trivial personality um, conflicts to, ruin everything,
Yeah.
because there would be a clear sense of that we're all working together for this shared mission. And, like, I think I'm not a critic. A lot of people will say, the Māori Party are just performative, and like they certainly have a performative theatrical style, and Rawiri in particular has pioneered that. And I'm not a critic of that because I think it had its time and its place, and it has actually changed politics for the better from a Māori perspective. But what has been missing often is that being paired with a very solid and relentless policy agenda that is, kind of relentlessly focused on the material interests of Māori, and of the Māori working class in particular. And so if you don't pair that kind of theatrical use of the parliamentary platform with, a serious policy agenda, then I think you're going to run into trouble, and you're not going to be able to sustain basically a whole caucus who are perhaps more focused on that kind of. I talk a lot about the Instagramification of politics, and I think that has played a role in this crisis. And it's not just the Māori Party that's affected, like it affects the Greens and others as well. But
It
like,
affects every party, mate.
yeah,
Mate, that's every party right now.
yeah,
Like, I think if all young people, the way they relate to politics is not the way that I know, Jack, you're a lot younger than Kyle and I, but the way that we used to relate to politics when we were young people is not the same as
yeah,
the way that if you're a teenager or even in your 20s right now, you're relating to politics right now. It is honestly, it's another world, right? We used to have to Google things. I know what a crazy world, but just,
Especially you have to read a book, Philip.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. Old man Carl over here. But just yeah, having to investigate on your own is an entirely different mechanism in terms of marketing, right?
Yeah, totally. And if from the perspective of if you're a politician, you actually have to put in the hard yards
Yeah.
and not basically rely on social media algorithms and being a celebrity on Instagram to kind of pursue your political agenda. And not to say that's necessarily easy. Like, I mean, I know I can't do it. I can't be a celebrity on Instagram, but I think it really simplifies and debases a lot of serious politics, to be perfectly honest.
I was going to ask around because we've got this obvious social media kind of marketing frame to the way
Mm.
that political PR is done, right? But how much do you think that has been exacerbated by the Westminster system and the way the parliamentary gallery worked anyway?
Mm.
This has always been something that minor parties, not just the Pāti Māori, have had to contend with is that they need to try and grab headlines. They feel
Mm.
like they need to get in the news and then do something with it as well. And the Instagram gamification has almost allowed them to get around that in a lot of ways. So I'm
Totally.
thinking in particular, like Hana in the House, right? Going
Mm.
absolutely global. It didn't matter if the media, the parliamentary gallery in New Zealand talked about that or not. But there was already this pressure to try and break out of the way that culture and that framework operated. I guess what are your thoughts around that? And then onward from that, how the media has treated what's happening internally in Te Pāti Māori at the moment.
Yeah, no, thanks for raising it, Kyle, because it's a really important point. And like I think a big factor in the Māori Party success has been their masterful ability at using digital platforms in terms of getting around traditional media barriers that exist for radicals and for minor parties, like the press gallery, most notably. And so, like the hikoi, which is the most recent hikoi, which despite what the media was saying, I was there. It was like in Wellington, it was like 100,000 people, biggest protest in the history of this country, and like that was largely driven through digital organizing. Not exclusively so. A lot of it was, that kind of grassroots word of mouth organizing that I talked about in Māori communities earlier. But and that is an extraordinary thing. And the Māori Party has rightfully utilized those communication channels to very successful ends. I think the issue with it is that you have to have a very strong will to not get sucked into that in terms of overpower, letting that feed your ego and then kind of overpower your the other aspects of your personality. So going back to Hannah, like she's someone who's you could say has probably benefited the most from that kind of thing. Like you said, she went global. Like she is natural and at home on those platforms, and yet she is very disciplined at staying humble. And I mean, it's just a natural part of her personality as well. But I think that has kind of kept her safe from a lot of these things. And I'm not trying to suggest that this is the only reason why these issues are playing out in the Māori Party, but ego is a big part of it, and that does exist in other parties too. I know that for sure. And I mean, obviously, we know ego exists in other parties, but I mean specifically this kind of dilemma of Instagram fed egomania. Um, and I think we're going to see more of it in left wing political spaces, and it's something we need to kind of grapple with and work out how to make the most of that and really respect those who know how to utilize those channels in a really powerful way, while also ensuring that we have political cultures that keep people grounded and keep people kind of working in solidarity in pursuit of collective goals.
Yeah, I want to raise as well this kind of dichotomy of the way that this is utilized against kind of minor parties and radicals and outsiders, I guess, and especially in the New Zealand political sphere, which is it's not just about going viral with something great, right? It's also used like in a, I hate to use the phrase, but a good cop, bad cop kind of way. Like, oh, we're all gonna love bomb you about this particular thing. You're the darling of the media this week. And then with stuff for Takata, just like really heavy, like just on top of him all the time, getting comment from everybody, and feeding the ego negatively in that way, really putting him on public trial.
Yeah, like I mean, like those were comments that he was rightfully called out on, but it's like I think that's a really interesting point. It's like both from a media, but also from that digital media perspective, traditional media and digital media perspective, he was under fire significantly. And I mean, we clearly saw in this case, not necessarily the right response, but he clearly did get his back up and basically then got into a stance of basically being like, nah, I'm not going to apologize. And in fact, I'm going to double down on these comments. And this is why I'm right kind of thing. And I think we've probably always had that in various ways. People get defensive, but I think it's kind of intensified in the way that everything is intensified when it's playing out on Instagram.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, long gone are the days where you could just sit down with someone and be like, "Hey, like I disagree.
Mm,
Can we just sit down and actually like look, we don't agree with every single point."
They're
Uh,
not long gone. Just look at New Zealand First and Act.
oh wow. No, you're right, Carl. They are best of friends, BFFs. Yeah. For those of you listening as opposed to watching, Kyle has the most shit-eating grin on his face right now that you will ever see. Yeah, but just to be like completely blunt about it, it is very frustrating, right? Like it's tough. It's tough to watch that kind of like distinction play out in real life, and it's not a, I don't know, what do you think, Jack? Like it's not an ideological distinction between Takada's like it Takada's comment on social media, that's not how you create a new party, right? Like
yeah,
I don't know if everyone here is old enough, but we're not creating a mana party here in terms of like ideology, right? It's an embarrassingly minor kind of I would say like a distraction level distinction. Like it's not a real thing.
yeah.
It's to me it's stupid. But how would you describe it, Jack?
Well, 100%. And I mean, but I think, Takuta and Marimin, neither of them are trying to, I think even now, establish a new party. Like, I think they genuinely are wanting to stay in the Māori party. Even, and I think they might not even realize, I mean, I'm sure they do. Like, but like things, in terms of relationship breakdowns, I'm fairly certain it's pretty irreconcilable at this point. But like, I think they are genuinely shocked that they got expelled. I think part of it, there's a part of kind of like political naivety in it, but also partly justified shock because it was pretty extreme to expel them. I think basically the point from which there was no return was, at least for Maria Mino, was when her son Eru Kapakingi, who was also a senior figure in the party and one of the leaders of the Hikoi, basically attacked the party on most major media platforms and accused them of running a dictatorship model and stuff. And
Yeah,
it's like
it's
when
not
you
good. It's not
no,
good. Don't
it's
do
not.
that.
And when you
For
also
all of our budding political operators out there, don't do that. Call
and
in
it's
first to
yeah.
10200.gmail.com before you start operating in that kind of way. I don't think it's the most professional way
That's not the email
to
address. I want
conduct
to be really
yourself.
clear. Don't try and email that.
You try to do that, Kyle. I'm trying to save you a lot of hate mail.
And especially don't do that if the person you're accusing of being a dictator is John Tamere. Like, if you're gonna come for JT, you better be ready.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you know, like, and so I think that was, yeah, that was the point in which it was like, okay, there's no coming back from this. But like, I think, following that, because I don't want to let the leadership off the hook either. Like the way in which they responded to that was vicious and unnecessary, and like, with letters that they knew were going to be leaked to the media, and it basically became an all-out civil war at that point. I think that if cooler heads had prevailed in that kind of period, then we might not be in the position that we're in now. And I think it's a real shame that that didn't happen, because at the end of the day, they needed to put their egos aside and actually remember that they're there to fight for the people who put them there. You know, there should have been compromise on both sides. And it's too late now, so there's not much point getting into it. But I wrote a column around that time, basically being like, clearly these rogue MPs, if you like, need to apologize and need to say that they accept the authority of the leadership, but also like the leadership need to show some humility too. And like I suggested at the time that John Tamahiri should step down as president and actually make way for a younger generation, make way for the establishment of new processes and culture within the party. And despite everything that's happened, something along those lines still needs to happen. And I'm not trying to say pinpoint it all on John Tamahiri either. But what I'm trying to say is that if you're in control of a party like he undeniably is, then you actually have to take responsibility for such a colossal failure of political management and movement building. So that's just undeniable at this point, and someone has to take responsibility for it. And Hunter rightfully said today, no one has taken ownership of this. Basically both sides are saying, we don't, like the co-leaders saying, we don't even know what their issue with us is, or the rogue MPs saying we don't know why we've been expelled. It's just silly at this point. It's like, take some ownership and responsibility for the position that you're in, and
Or at least publicly say, oh, we're talking through this, right?
yeah. And I still have love for a lot of these people, all of these people, in fact, on all sides. I think they're good people, and they're in politics for the right reasons. But it's just gotten so out of control that it's hard to see how it can be fixed at this point. Hone Harawira, going back to Hone, waded in recently and kind of set out I think a 7-point plan for how the party could be saved. And I agree with every word of him. Like, whether it's probably not achievable, like it's probably idealistic at this point, optimistic, but he was right to say it, because there is no scope for another Maori party, if you like. And based on the current trajectory of where this is going, Takuta and Māori Mino are going to absolutely lose their seats if it ends up being there's a Māori Party candidate, Labour Party candidate, and them as independents in those seats.
Yeah.
Labour will win in those seats, and it means they're not going to pick up, which would have been challenged anyway, they're not going to pick up Igoro Rāwhiti. So the Māori Party will probably go down to 4 seats, and even those aren't guarantees. The only one that's a guarantee is Hana's seat in Hauraki Waikato, but I don't think Labour, it'll be difficult for Labour to take on Debbie and Raori, or Orini, but it's just such a colossal failure given where they were just a few months ago. So yeah, I think as a movement, they need to take stock, and actually it's a make or break juncture, and they need to kind of go back to basics and work out why they're there, and how to achieve a kind of pan-Māori movement in a sustainable way, whether that's even possible.
Yeah, I mean that's isn't that the what 64 million whatever $1,000 question? Like, what does that mean, man? Like, what does a pan Māori movement look like ideologically? Because
Yeah.
there have been, as you've already detailed, I think really well, different kinds of Māori movements that have meant different things at different times to different people, and obviously, like, ideologically, that creates different junctures that at different points in time mean more or less to different groups of people. And that's kind of what political parties are, right? Or different political movements mean. Like the base of Te Pāti Māori now is entirely different from, if we go back 30 years, what you would have thought of as like the, I guess, cultural basis of pan Māori movement might have maybe looked like.
Yeah,
Don't
and
you
I
think?
think the issue really, I think the basis of a pan Māori party might be a stretch, but a basis of a successful broad-based Māori movement in politics has to be grounded in the working class. And it might be optimistic to think that it would be a party solely driven by the working class, given that pretty much all parties in New Zealand and in most Western democracies are dominated and driven by the middle classes and by the professionals. But I think that that's the only hope for a kind of broad-based Māori movement in the political system, is that it's grounded in pursuing both the material interests of the Māori working class and basically cultural reclamation and the constitutional transformation that we saw proposed in Mātiki Mai, because it goes broader than just the success of a political movement. Like, if I'm looking towards Moana Jackson's vision of having achieved basically tino rangatiratanga by 2040, 200 years since the signing of the treaty, to me, the biggest threat to that, or the biggest internal threat to that, there are many external threats to that, like climate change, nuclear war, but like the biggest internal threat to that we have control over as Māori is capitalism, and Māori capitalism in particular. And so what we have to do as Māori is grapple with the fact that if we are truly going to achieve tino rangatiratanga, because tino rangatiratanga is not just self-determination, it's also self-sufficiency. And not self-sufficiency in the Pākehā individual sense, but self-sufficiency in the collective social sense. And if you're going to achieve that, then you're going to have to reject Māori capitalism. And Māori capitalism is increasingly powerful. And, the Māori economy continues to grow, but not in a way that is redistributing wealth. Māori have the highest wealth inequality of any ethnic group in New Zealand. So the gap between the wealthy and the poor among just Māori is the widest. That is not sustainable. And like it's complicated in the sense that like, even the upper class, if you like, the ownership class in Te Ao Māori doesn't behave in the same way. The Māori, like iwi institutions, for example, do socialize many of their profits, but it's not at the scale that it needs to be, given the large-scale deprivation that our people experience. So, yeah, that's a very long answer, but that's essentially what we have to grapple with, and that's where kind of my focus is going to at the moment, is how do we build basically a movement for Māori socialism and a movement for recognizing that tino rangatiratanga can only be realized if it is grounded in a Māori version of socialism, because that's what we originally had, our tupuna. There are many problems with our traditional pre-colonial Māori society, but at the end of the day, there was not a ownership class. Wealth was distributed according to need. And so that's where any successful Māori political movement needs to be heading.
Well, imagine that. Clip that, world. That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Jack.
Put that on Instagram.
I know, right? That's good, man. I mean, like that's the kind of inspirational, I think, like combination of left-wing energy and Tino that like we've just been missing, man. Like even I don't know, anything post the Hikoi, the most recent like the amazing Hikoi that as you say it was like historic levels of support. And I think we jointly described after the recent the massive hikoi, we said like politics in New Zealand from now on will be described as like pre-hikoi or post-hikoi. Like this will be like the movement to end all movements. Like this is how we decide if something is meaningful or not. I think that was like incredibly meaningful. Um, and therefore, I think this like potential breakdown of a movement that otherwise was like undeniably ascendant is like just so frustrating, man. It's so frustrating.
And I think that was a problem in that, the Māori Party were essentially the genesis of the Toi Tū Te Tiriti movement, and
Yeah.
that's a problem. Like, as activists, we need to ensure that our movements are not tied to any political party. And so, like, that's a real huge lesson that I think Māori will learn from. But I think that there's always going to be ups and downs, as we know. There's always going to be blips in the struggle, and that's what I see this as, is like you're right. There is a pre-Hikoi and there's a post-Hikoi, and that's not going to change because of how the Māori Party has imploded, whether they pick themselves back up or not. It's like we need to realize that power, that we have that power. Pākehā movements in particular need to realize, how do we regain that power? Because Pākehā once had it, and they no longer do. One of the reasons why it was such a huge hiko, even compared to 2004, was the amount of tangata tiriti Pākehā supporting it, which is amazing. And all credit must be given to for that. But actually, how do non-Māori movements also regain that kind of ability to organize at that kind of deep community level, I think needs to be grappled with. And how do Māori translate that into real political gain? And, I think that's going to, as it always has, it's going to mean participating in all the parties and doing all the things and, using whatever levels of power that we have. It's not going to be one answer or one party. And, politicians might like to think that, as always, their party is going to be the answer. But as someone who's now been involved in 2 different parties and been around a while, I just know that is 100% not the case.
No, exactly. Thank you, Jack. Appreciate your time. I feel like you've given us a good wrap-up point. Do you want us to leave on any note? Do you think there's anything our listeners should be reading or listening to or paying attention to in particular that would help people to really contextualize or understand what's going on right now?
Really good question. I mean, I think people should start to follow and listen to many of the Māori leaders who aren't politicians, like Nai's Manual. If you don't know who Nai's Manual is, go and learn who Nai's Manual is. Like, she's the one who led the hikoi more than anyone. Like, wasn't in front of the Instagram camera, she was the one organizing it. Or like, the Aramaratas, or the, even our academics like Matthew Scobie, who's been talking about what a post-colonial, post-capitalist Aotearoa could actually look like. It's that's what, at least in my head is right now, is like trying to envision a kind of future, that a post-capitalist future that is grounded in our reality here in Aotearoa, because we need to be doing much more thinking about that, because overseas, like traditional models of socialist and post-capitalist thought aren't entirely applicable here, and so we need to come up with our own solutions. So yeah, that's where my head is at anyway.
Love it. Thank you, Jack. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thanks, Jack.
Great to talk with you guys.
As always, that's been another episode of 10200. Kyle, you got anything to chop in?
No.
Easy chop. All right. Have a good week, everybody. Appreciate your time. That's been a special episode of 10200 about Te Pāti Māori with one of our BFFs, Jack McDonald. We will link to Jack. Is there any way you want people to reach you, Jack in particular?
Good question. My
You're posting
email,
still, right?
My email is totoko.baxter@gmail.com. You can probably find me on Twitter or Instagram. Speaking of Instagram, so any way you can find me, please do.
He's easy to find. He's not that well hidden. He can't hide us. He can't hide from us. We appreciate you, Jack. Thank you so much. Tautoko. Speaking of that, and have a wonderful week, everybody. That's been another week of 10200. We will catch you next time.
If artificers are, then I'm living a pointless life, but I'm learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's apart now. It's paid with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.